Judge Hamilton adjusted his glasses, his tone steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of authority as he declared, "The court finds the landlord, Mr. Richard Brown, guilty of unlawful conduct involving a minor." The words echoed like thunder across the chamber. For a moment, no one breathed. Laura Miller, a 35-year-old single mother, clutched her daughter Emily's trembling hand. Emily, only 16, squeezed back, her wide eyes filling with tears. Laura's own face was frozen, part disbelief, part relief. Across the aisle, Richard Brown's expression collapsed. His lips quivered, his complexion drained of color. He slammed his palm on the table, his voice cracking. "That's not true. She's lying." "This is a setup," gasps rippled through the audience. The reporters in the back scrambled, cameras flashing relentlessly, capturing every twitch, every tear, every flicker of panic. The entire courtroom burst into noise murmurs, shocked whispers, and the frantic scratching of pens across notepads. For weeks, everyone had believed Laura was the one on trial, the single mother who had failed to pay her rent, the woman being dragged into court by her landlord, a respectable middle-aged man who seemed to have all the paperwork on his side. The story had been simple. She owed him money, and he wanted her out. But in a stunning twist, the tables had turned. Instead of Laura losing her home, Richard Brown now stood condemned as a criminal. Laura blinked, almost too stunned to react. Emily pressed closer to her mother, whispering through clenched teeth, "Mom, it's over, right?" But Laura's gaze never left Richard. Something in his reaction didn't sit right. This wasn't just fear of punishment, it was desperation, the kind that hides a deeper secret. Two officers stepped forward, ready to escort Richard out of the courtroom. He resisted, his face twisting in a rage. Suddenly he shouted, his voice loud enough to pierce the chaos. "You don't understand. I wasn't alone. Ask them. Ask the people who sent me." The room froze. Reporters stopped mid-scribble. Even the judge looked startled. What did he mean, I wasn't alone? Laura's heart skipped a beat. She gripped Emily tighter, her pulse racing. For a brief second, she wondered if they had just uncovered the tip of something much larger. The bailiffs dragged Richard toward the exit, but his words lingered in the air, heavier than the verdict itself. And that's where the story begins. A lawsuit over unpaid rent had spiraled into something far darker, a hidden crime, a desperate confession, and the haunting question, how did a simple landlord-tenant dispute turn into the unmasking of a predator? And more terrifying still, if Richard wasn't alone, who else was behind him? Laura Miller's 35 life was originally very simple. After her marriage broke up, she raised her daughter Emily, 16, alone. During the day, Laura worked as a cashier at the local supermarket. Not too hard work, but the meager salary was just enough to cover rent, utilities, and some basic living expenses. The job was boring, standing for 8 hours, smiling awkwardly at customers, punching each item into the cash register. Her hands were calloused from working the night shift, and her back was always sore after a long day. But for Laura, it was nothing, as long as she could pay the rent, buy books, and keep Emily a so-called normal life. The apartment the mother and daughter lived in was owned by Richard Brown, a middle-aged man in his 50s, always neat in appearance. Neighbors often saw him wearing a clean shirt, neatly combed hair, and polite speech. To outsiders, Richard is a good landlord, sometimes allowing tenants to delay paying their debts or showing concern with polite phrases like, "Just ask if you need anything." Every morning in the small apartment, the scene is always peaceful. Laura makes a cup of coffee, turns on the radio to listen to the news. Emily wears a faded backpack, her hair tied up, and quickly stuffs her notebook inside before rushing to the bus. She still retains the innocence of a teenager, sometimes whining to her mother, "Mom, can you make pancakes tomorrow? Just like before." Laura smiles gently, nods, trying to keep her child feeling normal, even though she is always worried about the upcoming rent. However, that peaceful picture is gradually clouded by gossip. One afternoon, when Laura was carrying her shopping bags home, the downstairs neighbor gently pulled her hand and whispered, "Mr. Richard is always paying attention to Emily. I saw the way you looked at her. It wasn't normal." Laura was startled for a moment, but then tried to smile reassuringly. "You must be mistaken. He's just the type of person who likes to pay attention to what's going on around him." In her heart, Laura dismissed it as a baseless rumor, but a cloud of doubt crept in. And then, another character entered the story, Mrs. Green, 60 years old, the neighbor who lived in the apartment across the street. She had been a widow for a long time, and she spent most of her days sitting by the window, observing everything that happened in the apartment building. Her eyes were sharp, her gaze was so intense that it made anyone who passed by feel creepy. Emily sometimes whispered to her mother, "Mom, Mrs. Green is watching us again." Laura waved her hand, but she herself had felt that gaze many times. It wasn't just the curiosity of a bored old woman, but it was as if Mrs. Green knew better than she cared to say. The night in the suburban apartment complex was usually quiet. The long corridors were lit only by the flickering yellow lights, and the clock on the wall in the living room ticked, tick, tick, tick. Laura usually went to bed early after a long shift at the supermarket, but many nights her sleep was torn apart by the shrill sound of the old landline phone on the wooden cabinet. The bell rang right around 2 or 3 in the morning. It didn't ring continuously, but only 3 times and then stopped, as if someone just wanted to make sure Laura heard it. The first time, she thought it was a mistake, but the third, fourth time at the same time, Laura began to feel strange. One night, when the bell rang, Laura woke up with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dark, with only the faint light from a street lamp outside the window shining in. She trembled as she held the receiver to her ear. On the other end of the line, there was no voice. There was only a heavy sigh, lasting for a few seconds, then, click! The line was cut off. Laura sat there, frozen, her hands still tightly gripping the receiver, feeling as if the entire apartment was being silently watched by a stranger. Another time, Emily accidentally caught her mother hastily hanging up the phone. She rubbed her eyes, sleepily asking, "Mom, who was it?" Laura forced a smile, stroking her daughter's hair. No one, just a wrong number. But she herself knew that no one had called the wrong number and kept calling at that exact time. The strangest thing, the landline phone screen always showed private caller. No number, no trace, as if someone was deliberately hiding their identity. The following nights, Laura did not dare to pick up the phone again. Every time the phone rang, she just lay still, listening in the dark, her whole body tense like a string. Emily even realized, "Mom, it always rings at the same time, doesn't it?" Laura was silent, avoiding her child's eyes. The climax was a stormy night. The phone rang again, the sound echoing in the quiet apartment. This time, Laura trembled to pick up the phone, intending to shout, "Who are you? What do you want?" But before she could say anything, a hoarse male voice came from the other end of the line, whispering only 3 words. "I see you." Then the line was cut off immediately. Laura dropped the receiver to the floor, her hands cold. She rushed to the window, looking out into the dark hallway. For a brief moment, Laura swore she saw a figure just passing the corner of the stairs. From that night, Laura began to realize the peace in this small apartment was just an illusion. Someone out there followed her and her mother's every breath. The apartment building where Laura and Emily lived was not very modern, but the apartment hallway was still equipped with several security cameras. They were installed in the corners of the walls, the shiny black lenses silently monitoring every movement. For most residents, it was the last layer of protection that helped them feel secure every night. However, Laura began to notice something strange. The camera mounted right above her apartment door almost never worked properly. Some days, the lens would blink. The display screen in the security room was filled with only black and white noise. Other days, the camera would suddenly turn in another direction, recording nothing but a blank wall and a patch of yellow light bulbs. Whenever Laura asked the building management, they would just shrug. "It must be a broken power cord. Let us fix it." But strangely, the cameras at the beginning of the hallway and near the elevator always worked normally. Only the one right in front of Laura's apartment accidentally had a problem over and over again. One evening, when Laura came home late from work, she looked up and saw that the camera had turned away, silently pointing at the moldy old wall. Her heart suddenly beat faster, and the thought flashed through her mind, "If anyone comes in or out of this apartment, no one will see." Emily also began to pay attention. "One time," she whispered to her mother as she passed under the turned-off camera, "Mom, why does it always stop working here? Like, someone doesn't want us to be seen." Laura gently held her daughter's hand, not knowing how to respond. The feeling of unease grew stronger. Laura remembered the anonymous calls in the middle of the night, then thought of the powerless camera right in front of her house. This piece connected with the other, forming a terrifying scenario. Someone was deliberately trying to hide their tracks, wanting their movements around their apartment to always be out of sight. From then on, every time Laura walked down the hallway, she no longer felt protected by the cameras. Instead, they were like blind eyes, leaving her and her mother under another invisible gaze, a gaze that Laura did not know where or who it came from. The hallway where Laura and Emily lived was not crowded. Occasionally, a few apartments were rented by young women, recent college graduates, or workers far from home. They came and went so quickly that almost no one had time to remember their names. One evening, while folding clothes, Emily suddenly hesitated and said to her mother, "Mom, do you remember Anna? She lives in the apartment on the right. I saw her downstairs last week, but yesterday when I came home from school, the room was empty. All the furniture was gone." Laura was slightly surprised. She remembered Anna, the girl in her 20s, petite, who always greeted her and her mother with a tired smile. Just last week, Laura had seen Anna carrying a bag of groceries. How could she disappear so suddenly? The next day, Laura asked Richard Brown when he was checking the hallway. Richard just shrugged and replied indifferently, "She moved out suddenly, that's all." Then he turned away without explaining further. The short answer made Laura uneasy. She had rented many places and had never seen anyone move out so quickly that they didn't even leave a greeting. Even the trash can in Anna's room had disappeared, as if the apartment had never been lived in. Emily was even more worried. She recalled, "Mom, I saw Anna crying in the hallway once." At that time, Richard was standing not far away. They looked very nervous. Laura frowned, a cold feeling creeping through her heart. The more Laura paid attention, the more she realized Anna was not the only case. During the 2 years she lived here, at least 4 other young tenants had disappeared so suddenly. They were all women, most of them very young. At first, Laura thought they were just moving, but now, with the files Emily found in the basement, she began to fear. One evening, Laura accidentally saw Mrs. Green sitting in front of the door, cleaning the window frame. As if reading Laura's mind, she chuckled, her voice low. People come and go, but some, they never leave the same way. Then Mrs. Bertwain. Green closed the door, leaving Laura standing there, frozen in the empty hallway. From that day on, every time she passed the empty apartment, Laura always had the feeling that the closed doors were hiding a secret that no one wanted to mention. And in her heart, the fear grew. Could it be that those disappeared people had not moved away, as Richard said, but had been drawn into something darker? One drizzly afternoon, Laura stopped by Mrs. Green's apartment to drop off some groceries. The old lady lived alone and rarely went out, so the neighbors occasionally helped. Her apartment was dark, the furniture was old, and it smelled of damp wood and ointment. While Mrs. Green was rummaging through the kitchen to retrieve the salt shaker Laura had brought over, Laura's eyes accidentally stopped on the small table near the window. There was a worn-edged, leather-bound notebook, open to a page covered in handwriting. Laura was curious and walked closer. The lines were crooked but clear. All names, dates, apartment numbers, even small notes like, arrived June 3rd, left September 10. She flipped through the pages quickly. Turning to another page, her heart suddenly tightened when she recognized a familiar name. Anna, apartment number 204. Next to it was a note. Left suddenly, 2 a.m. Before Laura could continue reading, the notebook was slammed shut. Mrs. Green was back, her cold eyes staring at Laura. "Curiosity doesn't always bring comfort, dear," she said softly, her voice hoarse. Laura stammered. That notebook, what is it?" Mrs. Green placed her thin hand on the notebook, her voice slow. "Some things are better not written down in your heart." Then she pulled the notebook back, hiding it in a drawer, the action decisive as if closing a secret that no one was allowed to touch. Laura left, her heart pounding. In her mind, a question kept swirling. Why did Mrs. Green have a whole notebook recording the details of each tenant? And how could she know exactly when they left? 2 a.m., 1045 a.m., if she hadn't seen it all herself? Emily listened to her mother, her eyes wide with worry. "So, she's been watching everyone all this time? Including us?" Laura was silent, not knowing how to answer. Her unease grew. Mrs. Green wasn't just some idle old woman who liked to sit and stare out the window. She was like a silent gatekeeper, recording every shadow that came and went in this building. And perhaps she knew more than anyone, even Richard. One weekend, while cleaning the apartment, Laura asked Emily to go down to the basement to get an old cardboard box. It took a long time for the girl to come back, her face pale. Emily had not only a cardboard box in her hand, but also an old file. "Mom, look at this." Inside were neatly arranged sheets of paper with the names, birth dates, and photographs of several young women. Most of them were tenants who had lived in the area for years. Some of the faces looked familiar, as if Laura had seen them briefly in the hallways. Young women who had moved in and then disappeared without a trace. Emily froze when she reached the last page. The printed photo was slightly blurred, but there was no mistaking it. It was her. A photo taken from behind as she walked down the sidewalk after school. The faded backpack, the tied-up hair, all so clear that Emily shivered. The girl dropped the file to the floor, her hands shaking. Her eyes widened, her lips moved, and finally she blurted out, "Mom, he's been watching me." Laura heard her daughter's voice and ran over. When she saw the photo, her blood froze. Laura's hand grabbed the paper, but it was shaking so much she couldn't hold it. She looked at her daughter, her eyes panicked. "Emily, when was this taken?" Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know, maybe last week?" "I wore this bag on Tuesday." Laura hugged her daughter tightly, her heart pounding. The midnight calls, the accidentally broken camera, the missing tenants. All of this suddenly gathered into one clear thread. The next target was Emily. In that moment, Laura was no longer just a mother worried about the rent. She transformed into a lioness ready to fight to protect her child. But deep in her eyes, fear was still swirling. Who was behind these photos, after all? And why did she choose her daughter? Laura shivered, clutching the file. A chill ran down her spine. Why did the landlord Richard keep this kind of document? That very evening, when Laura was still wondering what to do, Mrs. Bass's Green happened to meet the mother and daughter at the door. She looked straight into Laura's eyes, her voice soft but cold. "Not the first, not the last." Without another word of explanation, she slowly turned back to the apartment. Laura stood still. Emily shook her mother's hand. "What does she mean, Mom?" Laura couldn't answer, but fear began to rise in her heart. Maybe Richard was not simply a difficult landlord, and maybe, the old rumors, were not made up. On winter nights, the hallway of the boarding house became eerily quiet. There was only the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the windows, the sound of old water pipes tapping somewhere in the wall. Laura usually tried to sleep early, but not every night she could rest. Sometimes, around 11 o'clock at night, when Laura had just dozed off, there was a light knock at the door. At first she thought it was a neighbor who needed help, but when she opened the door, The hallway was completely empty. No one. Only the pale yellow light that fell on the mottled tile floor. This phenomenon repeated itself several times. One day the knocking even rang out 3 times in a row, then stopped. Laura tried to peek through the peephole, but outside was only a quiet hallway, no movement. Emily heard it and began to panic. "Mom, what if someone's messing with us?" Laura tried to rub her child's head, but she couldn't calm herself down either. Then one morning, as she was getting ready for work, Laura opened the door and was stunned. Right in the middle of the wooden door, in a scribble of white chalk, appeared the words, "Leave!" Laura touched the words, the chalk dust still on her fingers. Her heart pounded. This was no child's play. The scribble was source salute, like a message sent straight to her and her mother. Either leave, or something will happen. Emily walked out of the house, saw the words, and turned pale. "Mom, is it him? Is it Richard?" Laura did not answer. She just took a wet towel and wiped it quickly, as if to erase the evidence of the threat. But the more she wiped, the more her heart trembled. That night, Laura tossed and turned, unable to sleep. She knew clearly the midnight calls, the broken camera, the missing tenant, Mrs. Bissing, Green's mysterious notebook, and now the message right on the door. None of it was a coincidence. In the darkness, Laura gently squeezed the hand of her daughter, who was sleeping soundly beside her. The feeling was clear in her heart. They were not just being watched. They were being hunted. The pressure began when Richard kept pressuring Laura to pay the rent on time. When they met in the hallway, he was no longer as polite as before. His tone became more and more harsh. "Laura, if you can't pay by the end of the week, I'll have no choice but to evict you." Laura nodded, trying to stay calm. She knew she hadn't saved enough money. But what worried her more was Richard's constant gaze on Emily. More than once, she caught him standing outside the window, watching her as she left for school. Then one evening, after Laura had just finished work, Emily suddenly burst into tears, hugging her mother tightly. Her whole body trembled, her voice choked. "Mom, he touched me. He said if we tell anyone, we'll lose the house." Laura was speechless. Her ears were ringing. Her heart seemed to stop beating. She tried to comfort her, but her hands were clenched so tightly that they bled. Her whole body trembled with fear and indignation. The next morning, Laura decided to confront Richard, but he just smiled faintly and waved his hand. "Don't make up stories, Laura. You're just behind on rent, that's all." That arrogant look made Laura even more indignant. One night, when Laura opened the door, there was a strange envelope on the porch. Inside was a blurry photo of Richard and Emily standing close together. Richard's face was bent down while Emily stepped back, her eyes filled with fear. Although the photo was not clear, just a glance was enough to see that the situation was not normal. Laura held the photo tightly, her heart pounding. Who had left this envelope on her doorstep? Someone who wanted to help, or someone who was threatening her. A few days later, another clue appeared. In a bar near the neighborhood, Richard was drunk, with his arm around a friend's shoulder. He said loudly, his voice slurring, "That little girl is mine to control." A nearby customer recorded it, and somehow the recording was sent to Laura's phone. Hearing those words again, Laura's whole body got goosebumps. This was no longer a doubt. This was proof. But at the same time, she understood. If someone was strong enough to get the recording in the bar and send it to her, it meant that she and her mother were under surveillance. That night, Laura returned home and noticed that the main door lock had been broken. She frantically checked the entire apartment. Nothing was missing, no trace of a search. There was only a small piece of paper placed in the middle of the dining table. On it, in a scribbled handwriting, were only 2 words: "Stay quiet." Laura held a piece of paper, her hands trembling. Emily asked fearfully, "Mom, what if they come back?" Laura pulled her daughter closer, hugged her tightly, trying to hide the fear in her eyes. But she knew this was a warning. A few days later, things came to a head. On the way home from work, Laura drove Emily in her old car. While going downhill, she stepped on the brake pedal, but the pedal slipped and did not respond. The car sped away. Laura panicked and swerved, luckily using the handbrake and hitting the grass on the side of the road. Both mother and daughter were shocked, but fortunately unhurt. When the car was checked, the mechanic confirmed someone cut the brake cable. This is not a normal problem. The bad news was like a knife stabbing straight into Laura's heart. It was no longer just a threat. Someone wanted to silence her forever. While Laura was immersed in a series of events, the envelope of photos, the stay quiet note, and the near-fatal accident, John Ione afternoon, the phone rang unexpectedly. An unknown number appeared on the screen. Laura hesitantly picked up the phone, her voice worried. "Hello, who is this?" On the other end of the line, a trembling female voice rang out. "Laura, it's me, Rachel. Do you remember me?" Laura was stunned. Rachel, the girl who had rented the apartment upstairs a few years ago. The two occasionally chatted. Then one day, Rachel suddenly moved away without saying goodbye. Laura thought Rachel had simply moved out. Rachel's voice was urgent, as if she was afraid someone would hear. "Listen, Laura, I know about Richard. I know what he's been doing. You're not safe there." "What do you mean?" Laura held her breath. "I can't say over the phone. Meet me tonight, 8 o'clock, at the old diner on 5th Street. Don't bring anyone else." Then Rachel hung up. Laura stood there, her heart pounding. For the first time, someone else acknowledged that what she and Emily were experiencing was not just a hallucination. That night, Laura went to the restaurant they had arranged to meet at. The diner was old, the neon lights flickering red and blue. She chose a hidden table near the window, her eyes constantly looking out. The clock hands gradually passed 8 o'clock, then 8:30, then 9 o'clock. But Rachel never showed up. Laura called, but Rachel's phone was turned off. The text messages couldn't be sent either. A feeling of unease rose. Laura looked around, saw a few customers sitting sparsely, the sound of knives and forks clattering. But to her, that sound echoed like a knife stabbing her heart. Finally, Laura had no choice but to leave. On the way, a light rain fell. The streetlights were patchy. She kept looking back, feeling like someone was following her, but every time she turned back, she only saw an empty street. The next day, Laura tried to contact her again. She asked a few old friends around the old boarding house, but no one knew where Rachel was. Even Rachel's rental records had disappeared from Richard's office, as if she had never lived there. Laura was stunned, filled with fear. Emily held her mother's hand and whispered, "Mom, what if they silenced her?" Laura was speechless. The image of Rachel, her trembling voice, her unfinished date reverberated through her mind. The only person who had dared to tell the truth had disappeared without a trace. One evening, as Laura was cleaning the basement for more evidence, Emily dragged out an old cardboard box. In it, in addition to the yellowed files, there was a blue hardcover notebook, its edges frayed and its pages yellowed by moisture. Emily blew the dust off and opened it. The first pages were covered in handwriting, a young girl's scribbled, hurried handwriting. She had jotted down the usual stories, her part-time job, her rent payments, and Richard's visits from his landlord. But the more she read, the heavier the atmosphere became. The tone of the diary gradually became panicked. He kept looking at me, as if I were his property. I heard a knock at the door in the middle of the night. When I opened it, there was no one. I saw that the camera in front of the room was off again. For the third time, Laura read this, cold sweat running down her spine. Emily bit her lip, whispering, "Mom, it sounds just like what we're going through." On the last page, the handwriting suddenly trembled, the ink blurred, as if written in a panic. There was only one short line. "If anything happens to me, it's Richard, but he's not the only one." Laura was speechless. That sentence was like a knife piercing her heart. The writer, probably one of the tenants who had disappeared, knew that she was surrounded. Richard was the direct culprit, but there was someone else behind it. Emily whispered, her voice choked. "Not the only one, so there's more than Richard, Mom." Laura clutched the notebook, her eyes red. "Yes, sweetheart, he's not working alone." At that moment, Laura understood clearly. The person threatening her and her mother was not just a perverted landlord. Behind him, there could be a whole network, people who sheltered, protected, and even benefited from the silence of the victim. Since discovering her own photo in the basement file, Emily was no longer the innocent girl she used to be. She began to be startled by the smallest noises, the sound of a water pipe rattling in the wall, the sound of a window shaking slightly in the night wind, or even the sound of a neighbor's footsteps walking across the hallway. Every night, before going to bed, Emily would pull the curtains 2 or 3 times, then check the door latch until her hands were red and sore. Laura noticed that her daughter no longer liked looking in the mirror, nor did she write in her diary. Instead, Emily often sat on the bed, her eyes staring blankly into the darkness in the corner of the room. Late one night, Laura had just turned off the light and was about to go to sleep when she heard her daughter whisper, "Mom, what if they're already inside the building?" Laura was stunned. There was something heavy in that trembling voice, as if Emily could no longer distinguish between real fear and the haunting in her mind. Laura hugged her daughter, stroking her messy hair. "No, sweetheart, we're safe here. I'm with you." Emily did not cry, just shook her head, whispering as if talking to herself. But the phone calls, the notes on the door, what if they're closer than we think? Laura was silent. She knew that all the reassurance at the moment was meaningless. In fact, she herself felt surrounded. But looking at her daughter's haggard appearance, Laura felt her heart being torn apart even more. In the following days, Emily's condition worsened. At school, the teacher called to report that Emily often sat alone, her eyes were lost, and her academic performance had clearly declined. She wrote in a short essay, "Sometimes I feel like someone is standing right behind me, even when I'm alone." Laura read it and her heart ached. Once, when she came home from the market, Laura opened the door and saw Emily sitting on the floor, hugging her knees, staring at the door as if someone had just knocked. The girl whispered, "Mom, I heard it again." 3 knocks. Just like before. Laura tried to keep her voice calm. "It's just the wind, Emily." But in her heart, she knew clearly that knocking sound could not be just the wind. Laura went to the young lawyer, Michael Harris, 32 years old, tremblingly telling him the whole story. After listening, Michael frowned, his voice solemn. "Laura, this isn't just about unpaid rent. Someone is protecting him, and they're willing to hurt you to keep it quiet." Laura sat stunned on the chair. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but her eyes flashed with determination. No matter how dangerous it was, she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. After the brake cut incident, Laura no longer hesitated. She sought out the young lawyer Michael Harris, a famous outspoken person who had defended many difficult cases. Sitting opposite in the cramped office, Laura recounted everything, from the envelope of photos, the diary of the former tenant, to the knocks on the door in the middle of the night. Michael Harris is a young lawyer who has opened his own office for less than 3 years. He is not a big name in the legal world, but is known by many people for his outspoken personality, daring to take on difficult cases that many colleagues refused. Michael grew up in an ordinary working-class family. His mother was a nurse, and his father was just a worker. Since childhood, he witnessed his mother being oppressed by the landlord, even almost losing her apartment because she could not afford the rent. It was that memory that planted in Michael the belief that justice is not only for the rich. The fate between Michael and Laura began one evening when Laura desperately sought help after the brake cut accident. She wandered into Michael's small office, where there was only an old wooden sign hanging on the door. Harris Law, justice for everyone. Laura recounted everything, her voice trembling, her hands still scratched from the accident. She could not hide her despair. Mr. Harris, I don't have much money. I don't even know if I can pay the lawyer's fees. But if I stay silent, Emily will never be safe. Michael sat silently for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on the woman opposite him. Thin, haggard, but in his eyes burned the determination to protect his daughter. He remembered his own mother in the past, who had also cried because she was cornered. He nodded slightly. Money is not the problem, Laura. I took this case, not for the money. I took it because it was right. Michael listened, his eyes narrowed thoughtfully. After a moment of silence, he said, Laura, are you sure you want to continue? I don't deny what you said, but if Richard really has someone backing him up, they will do everything they can to bury the truth. It won't be easy. Laura clenched her hands in her lap, her eyes blazing. If I stay silent, what will happen to Emily? They've targeted her. I can't let her live in fear for the rest of her life. Michael nodded, his gaze more determined. He began to collect evidence, contact witnesses, and prepare for a formal lawsuit against Richard. However, trouble followed, one after another. The first piece of evidence disappeared. The photo album in the envelope, something that could have forced Richard to face difficult questions, was suddenly missing from the court records. Michael claimed he had submitted it himself, but when he checked again, the archives reported, not found. Laura was stunned. She almost screamed, No way, I remember it was sealed. Michael was calm, but his face was pale. Someone deliberately erased the traces. This proves that we are on the right track, and they are starting to worry. The first court session took place in a small, cold room. Michael confidently brought the evidence file, in which was a photo of Richard standing next to Emily in an anonymous envelope. It was the most important evidence, the one that could make Richard's just a misunderstanding defense collapse. But when the judge asked for an inspection, the court staff opened the file. Inside was no longer the photo Laura had given. Instead, there was a blurry photo. The light was patchy, almost unrecognizable. Laura jumped up, her face pale. No, that's not the photo. I gave you the real one. It was clear. You could see Richard's face. The room was in an uproar. The judge frowned. Mrs. Miller, this is the only photo submitted to the court. If you're suggesting evidence tampering, you'll need proof. Laura was stunned. She looked at Michael, her eyes filled with confusion. Michael quickly stood up. Your Honor, I personally checked the evidence before submission. This photo is not the original. Someone must have interfered with the chain of custody. But that sentence only made the atmosphere more tense. Richard's lawyer immediately objected. His voice curled. That sounds like an excuse, Your Honor. Perhaps the plaintiff never had such a photo at all. A sarcastic laugh broke out behind him. Laura clenched her fists, her eyes filled with tears. She wanted to shout that she wasn't crazy, that the evidence had been tampered with, but all the suspicious looks in the room made her throat choke. After the session, Laura walked out into the hallway, trembling, almost collapsing into her chair. Michael sat next to her, his voice dropping. Laura, I swear to you, I saw the original photo. It was sharp, unmistakable. Someone altered it after I submitted it. Laura choked. So that means someone in this very courthouse is helping him? Michael nodded slowly. His eyes darkened, his voice lowered. Yes. And that's the scary part. We're not just fighting Richard. We're tapping into a network whose hands reach deep into the legal system. Laura covered her face, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she felt a suffocating sense of helplessness. Even justice, the only place she could rely on, could be manipulated. Michael put his hand on Laura's shoulder, his voice firm. But that's why we have to keep going. If we give up, they will win, and Emily will never escape this darkness. Before Laura could recover, she received another shocking news. A neighbor who had promised to testify that he had seen Richard approach Emily many times suddenly changed his mind. In court, this person coldly said, I never saw anything. I think I was wrong. Laura was stunned. After the testimony, she ran after him, trying to hold his hand. Why? Why did you change your statement? The neighbor lowered his head and whispered, I can't. I have kids too. Then he quietly left, leaving Laura devastated with a feeling of betrayal. Just a few days after the first session ended, Laura was startled to see a copy of the local newspaper thrown right in front of her door. On the front page, the headline read, "Single Mother Invents Abuse Story to Avoid Eviction." Laura's entire body went cold. She opened the paper with trembling hands, her eyes glued to every line. The article was full of falsehoods. That Laura was constantly behind on rent, that she had had several arguments with her landlord, and that the teenage daughter may have imagined or exaggerated the story. The article even quoted an anonymous neighborhood source as saying, "I never saw Mr. Brown do anything inappropriate. Laura just doesn't want to pay." Laura was stunned. Each word was like a knife to her heart. She knew immediately. Only Richard and the forces behind him could have concocted this scenario and pushed it into the media. As Laura slumped into the chair, her eyes blurred, Emily slowly walked out of the bedroom, holding her phone trembling. "Mom, look at this. Everyone's sharing it on Facebook. They're calling me a liar." The phone screen displayed dozens of vicious comments. Typical single mom, always playing the victim. Teenagers make up stories all the time. That poor landlord being dragged through the mud. Emily burst into tears, threw the phone on the bed, and shouted, "Why are they doing this to us? I told the truth. Why won't they believe me?" Laura hugged her child tightly, but tears also filled her eyes. For the first time, she felt that not only Richard, but also the outside society was turning its back on her. That afternoon, Michael stopped by, crumpled up newspaper in hand. "I knew they would do this, but I didn't expect it to be so quick and so brazen. Laura, they don't just want to win in court, they want to ruin your reputation in public. When society doubts you, your and Emily's testimony will lose weight." Laura shook her head in despair. "But how do we fight this? I don't even have money to sue a newspaper." Michael clenched his jaw. "We won't sue the newspaper. We'll prove to the court that the truth is stronger than lies. But from now on, you and Emily must be steadfast. Any loophole will be turned into a weapon by them." The most painful blow came from an unexpected source. During a court session, Mrs. Green, a neighbor who seemed to know a lot and could be an important witness, suddenly stood up to present evidence against Laura. Her voice was cold. "Emily is a sensitive child. She makes up stories when she's scared. This is just because they're afraid of losing the apartment." Those words rang out like a knife stabbing straight into Laura. The whole room murmured. Many eyes began to doubt. Michael clenched the file, turned to look at Laura, his eyes full of worry. Laura trembled, unable to believe her ears. The woman who had warned many times with the words, "Not the first, not the last," now turned around, denying everything. After that session, Laura found Mrs. Green in front of her house, her voice choked. "Why did you do that? You know the truth." Mrs. Green just looked at her. A faint smile flashed, then slammed the door shut without saying another word. Before Laura could recover from the shock, Emily became the target of a psychological game. The rumor from the article spread faster than Laura thought. In just a few days, it crept into the hallway of Emily's school. At first, it was just curious looks. But then, everything gradually turned into malicious whispers behind her back. One morning, when Emily entered the classroom, two girls sitting at the back table deliberately spoke loudly enough for her to hear. She made it up, just for attention. "Yeah, probably wants people to feel sorry for her." Emily heard every word clearly. Her heart dropped. She tried to lower her head, quickly walked back to her seat, but that whole day, no one talked to her again. At lunchtime, her friends who used to sit at the same table avoided going to other tables. Emily's food tray was placed alone. No one dared to approach. There were a few pitying looks, but most were distant and contemptuous. That afternoon, when Emily returned home, she threw her backpack on the chair, rushed straight into her room, and slammed the door. Laura ran after her, knocked on the door. "Emily, open up, sweetheart. What happened?" Inside, Emily's voice choked. "They don't believe me, Mom. They think I'm lying. Everyone thinks I just made it up." Laura's heart ached as she listened. She pressed her forehead against the wooden door, tears streaming down her face. "No, Emily, you told the truth. I believe you, and the truth will come out." The door remained closed. Laura heard her daughter sobbing so hard that it was suffocating. From that day on, Emily became quieter. She was no longer enthusiastic about writing, no longer dreaming about journalism as before. Every morning, Laura had to beg Emily to go to school. Michael also noticed this change. During a meeting with Laura, he saw Emily sitting huddled in the corner of the room, her eyes lost. He said softly, "Laura, we have to keep Emily strong. If she falls, her testimony will be shaky, and they will take advantage of it." Laura nodded, but her heart ached. She understood clearly. It was not just Richard and the forces behind him who were pushing mother and daughter to the end. The whole society, and those invisible, suspicious eyes, were also suffocating Emily every day. One evening, Emily hugged her phone tightly, her face pale. Laura panicked and asked, "Emily, what is it?" She showed the screen to her mother. On it was an anonymous message. "Emily, tell them the truth. Don't lie, or your mom will pay." Laura was stunned. Someone was directly manipulating her daughter. They wanted Emily to waver, wanted to turn her testimony into a contradiction, to destroy the lawsuit from within. Emily trembled and hugged her mother. "Mom, what if they're right? What if speaking up makes everything worse?" Laura hugged her daughter tightly, her eyes filled with tears. "No, sweetheart. The only thing worse than speaking up is staying silent. After the painful betrayal in court, when Mrs. Stout Green stood up and coldly said that Emily made up the story because she was afraid of losing her house, Laura no longer wanted to see her neighbor. Every time she passed the door of the apartment opposite, she tried to walk quickly, avoiding her eyes. However, Mrs. Green's silence did not seem to mean the end. On the contrary, from that day on, she observed the mother and daughter more and more. Every afternoon, when Laura took Emily home from school, Mrs. Brast Green still sat behind the old window, her small figure, her deep eyes staring. Not a word of greeting, not a nod, just a quiet, cold presence, making Laura feel overwhelmed. Then one night, while Laura was washing dishes in the kitchen, she suddenly heard a soft knock on the door. 3 regular beats, like the times before. She paused, her heart beating fast, and carefully walked to the door. Pulling the latch gently, Laura opened it. The alley was deserted, the yellow light casting long, mottled shadows on the tiled floor. There was no one. There was only a small piece of paper stuck under the door. Laura picked it up with trembling hands. On it, in familiar scribbles, was clearly written a line, "Don't trust me. Don't trust anyone." Laura was stunned. This handwriting was the same handwriting that had appeared on the "Stay Quiet" note before. Her hands were shaking. A question swirled in her mind. Was Mrs. Green really a traitor? Or was she just playing the traitor to hide something? If she deliberately opposed Laura in court, was it because she was forced? Or was she also under the control of the forces behind Richard? Laura hugged the piece of paper tightly, turned into the house, her eyes full of conflict. Emily saw it and asked softly, "Mom, is it from her again?" Laura nodded, her voice hoarse. "Yes, but I don't know if she's warning us or betraying us." Emily was silent, hugging her mother tightly. In Laura's heart, doubts piled up. Was Mrs. Green a friend or an enemy? A secret ally or a puppet of the forces behind it? The courtroom was packed that morning. The air was so heavy that every breath was audible. Cold white fluorescent lights illuminated everyone's tense faces. Reporters crowded the hallway, cameras trained on the heavy wooden doors. Laura sat next to attorney Michael Harris, her hand shaking as she held her daughter Emily's. Despite her efforts, Laura could feel her heart pounding. The whole ordeal, the envelopes of photos, the late-night knocks, the car's brakes cutting out, had all led to this moment. The trial began. The judge banged his gavel, his voice reverberating solemnly through the room. "Today we will hear the testimonies and examine the evidence in the case of Laura Miller versus Richard Brown." Richard entered, his suit neatly tailored, his face pale but still trying to appear calm. His eyes glanced quickly at Laura, a faint smirk on his lips. Beside him was an experienced defense attorney, so confident that many people thought victory was in their hands. The air was silent when Michael stood up. "Your Honor, I would like to call Emily Miller to the stand." The room was in an uproar. A 16-year-old girl, small in stature, walked slowly up to the witness stand. Emily's eyes were worried, her hands clutched the edge of her dress, but her voice rang out firmly. "My name is Emily Miller, and I need to tell you what happened." The girl took a deep breath, then recounted everything. Richard's strange eyes, the time he touched her, the threat, "If you tell anyone, you'll lose the house." In the courtroom, many people covered their mouths, some shook their heads indignantly. Richard's attorney jumped up, his voice sarcastic. "Emily, aren't you just exaggerating because your mother can't pay the rent?" Emily trembled slightly, but then looked straight at Richard, tears rolling down, her voice ringing out clearly. "No, I'm telling the truth. He touched me. He scared me, and I don't want to be silent anymore." The whole room fell silent. The testimony of a little girl, trembling but sincere, was stronger than any evidence. Laura choked, tears falling. The trial was heating up after Emily's brave testimony. The atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to be stifling. All eyes were on Richard. He tried to keep his composure, but his hands were clenched, veins stood out, his cheeks were red with anger. When everyone thought the testimony was over, Michael suddenly stood up, his voice resounding loudly. "Your Honor, I would like to call one more witness, someone who has been silent for too long." The whole audience gasped. Richard jumped, his eyes flashing with horror. The door to the courtroom opened. A female figure entered, a thin figure, a haggard face, but eyes shining with determination. Laura was stunned. It was Anna, the girl who rented the room next door, who had disappeared without a trace months ago. Laura had believed that Anna had left quietly, but now, here she was, right in the middle of the trial. Anna walked slowly up to the witness stand. Her voice was shaky but clear. "My name is Anna Peterson. I used to live at Mr. Brown's property, and I'm here to tell you he did it to me too." The murmurings rose like breaking waves. The judge banged his gavel several times before he regained order. Anna took a deep breath, then continued. "For months he followed me, touched me without consent, and threatened that if I spoke, I would lose my home. I was terrified. That's why one night I packed my things and disappeared. I thought if I left, I'd finally be safe, but I've never been free, not until today." Laura covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling up. Emily looked at Anna, her eyes wide open, as if she had just seen her own future if she remained silent. Richard's lawyer jumped up, trying to stop him. "Objection. This testimony is irrelevant and prejudicial," Michael immediately retorted. On the contrary, Your Honor, this testimony proves a pattern of abuse, showing Mr. Brown's consistent predatory behavior toward his tenants. The judge nodded, allowing Anna to continue. Anna turned to look at Richard, her eyes determined, no longer afraid. You ruined my life, Richard. But you will not ruin hers, she pointed straight at Emily. I stayed silent once. I won't stay silent again. Richard turned pale, sweating. He stammered. She's lying. She left because she couldn't pay rent. But the audience had changed their attitude. Everyone's eyes were filled with anger and contempt. Richard's feeble excuses only made him more pitiful. Laura held Michael's hand tightly, choking. I thought she was gone forever. Michael nodded slightly, his voice deep and steady. Sometimes the truth finds its way back, no matter how hard they try to bury it. Anna's appearance was not only a shock to Richard, but also a morale booster for the entire courtroom. It proved that Emily was not the only victim, and that this dark network had existed for a long time with many other victims. After Emily's testimony and Anna's shocking appearance, the courtroom began to tilt towards Laura. But Michael did not stop there. He stood up, his eyes sharp, his voice loud and clear. Your Honor, the defense has argued that there is no concrete evidence of Mr. Brown's inappropriate behavior. But today, I present to the court a piece of evidence that speaks louder than any words. He held up a small USB drive and plugged it into the projection screen in the middle of the courtroom. Laura's heart was pounding, and Richard suddenly stopped. For a brief moment, his eyes flashed with horror, as if he knew exactly what was in it. The screen lit up. The security video, although a little grainy, was still clear enough. The hallway of the apartment building appeared. The clock in the corner of the screen recorded the time 2:13 a.m. In the frame, Richard appeared. He was wearing a dark jacket, quietly approaching Laura's apartment. Richard stopped in front of the door, bent down to look at the lock, then reached out to touch the doorknob, as if trying to open it. He lingered around for nearly 2 minutes, occasionally turning his head to look around, then quietly left. The audience erupted in whispers. Many people covered their mouths, and several reporters immediately started clicking away. Michael pointed straight at the screen. This is not a landlord checking on his property. This is a man sneaking around a teenage girl's apartment in the middle of the night. The judge banged his gavel to demand order, but even he himself could not hide the anger in his eyes. Richard jumped up and shouted, "That video is illegal. It was supposed to be deleted." That sentence unintentionally became a confession. The entire courtroom fell silent for a few seconds, then exploded. Laura grabbed Emily's hand, her heart pounding. Michael did not miss the opportunity, his voice sharp. "Thank you, Mr. Brown, for confirming that you knew about this footage and tried to make it disappear. The court can see for itself who you really are." Richard turned pale, sweat pouring down his temples. His lawyer quickly intervened, but his voice was off. "Objection. This doesn't prove any abuse." Michael responded immediately, firmly. "It proves intent. It proves stalking. It proves a pattern. And combined with the testimonies, it paints a picture no jury can ignore." The atmosphere in the courtroom was boiling. Laura could clearly see all eyes on Richard, no longer doubt, but contempt and indignation. Richard gasped, his eyes bloodshot, stammering. They set me up. This is a setup." But no one believed him anymore. The evidence was exposed, and his panic only became a tighter noose. After the security video was shown, the whole courtroom erupted in a fierce reaction. Richard panicked, and the defense attorney, Mr. Jonathan Pierce, an old and experienced face, hastily stood up, his voice urgent. "Your Honor, this so-called evidence is circumstantial. A landlord has every right to check on his property. And as for the photo, that blurry picture was never admissible. Everyone knows the original photo." He paused. It was too quick, but it was enough to make the whole room hold its breath. Michael immediately caught on. "Excuse me, counselor, did you just say the original photo? How would you know what the original looked like, unless you saw it before it was entered into evidence?" The whole room gasped. Laura was stunned, turning to Michael. Emily sat huddled, her heart pounding. Jonathan tried to salvage the situation, his face pale. "I misspoke. I meant the version that was presented here." Michael took a step forward, his voice as sharp as a knife. "No, you said the original, which means you knew it existed, and you knew it was different from the blurred copy. That raises only one question. How did you know, unless you or someone connected to you tampered with the evidence?" The atmosphere in the courtroom froze. The judge looked serious, banging his gavel to demand order. Many reporters immediately took notes. Cameras flashed. Jonathan stammered, sweating. That's ridiculous. I simply heard rumors. That's all." But his evasive gaze said it all. Richard, in a panic, turned to his lawyer, screaming, "You promised me it was gone. You said no one would ever see it again." That sentence was like a hammer blow to Jonathan. The courtroom exploded. Michael calmly turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the defense counsel's knowledge of evidence tampering strongly suggests collusion beyond just the defendant. This isn't just Richard Brown on trial. This is a system protecting him. Laura held her daughter's hand tightly, her heart trembling with fear and a glimmer of hope. Finally, what she had been worried about for so long, that Richard had not acted alone, was revealed right before everyone's eyes. Driven to the brink, Richard lost control. He slammed the table, shouting loudly, his voice filled with anger. "She wanted it. She came to me first." The entire courtroom fell silent. No one moved. The judge glared at Richard while reporters immediately pressed the shutter, the flashbulbs flashing continuously. Laura hugged Emily tightly, her heart clenched. In that moment, everyone understood that Richard and, yes, he confessed. Although he tried to justify himself, that scream exposed his true nature. Immediately after Emily's shaky but determined testimony, combined with Anna's sudden appearance and the restored security video, the atmosphere in the courtroom tilted towards Laura. But the more surprising thing happened outside the courthouse door. Reporters, almost simultaneously, rushed out into the hallway, typing on their laptops and whispering on the phone. Within hours, new news stories began to explode on electronic newspapers. Social networks were flooded with the phrase, "Richard Brown exposed as predator." In complete contrast to previous articles that had slandered Laura for making up stories to avoid paying rent, this time, the image that went viral was Richard's face hovering in front of Laura's house in the middle of the night, cut from the security video. Angry comments appeared in droves. "Monster, lock him up, poor Emily. She's so brave to speak out. How many more victims are there?" When the court adjourned, Laura and Emily were led to the side door of the court. Both of them froze. A crowd had gathered, holding banners, chanting, "Justice for Emily, justice for the victims." The sound echoed, strong, creating a complete contrast to the previous days, when the press had published the headline, "Single Mother Invents Story to Avoid Eviction." Emily held her mother's hand tightly, her eyes filled with tears, whispering, "Mom, they believe us now." Laura choked, her heart filled with both emotion and pain. She knew this belief had been exchanged for so much fear, blood, and tears. But at least the public no longer turned their backs on them. In the courtroom, Michael also took advantage of the public opinion effect. He stood up, pointed out the window where the shouts echoed. "Your Honor, the world is watching. This case is no longer just about one mother and her daughter. It's about a pattern of abuse that must end." The judge banged his gavel, maintaining order, but his eyes were also heavy with thought. Richard, on the other hand, was increasingly flustered. He turned to the door, saw the angry crowd, saw dozens of cameras pointed at him. He shouted, "They don't know the truth. They're being manipulated. I'm the victim here." But that voice was lost in the sea of first shouts demanding justice. And for the first time, Richard understood. He had lost not only his defense in court, but also his cover of public opinion outside. After hearing the whole thing, the judge announced, "The court finds Richard Brown guilty of unlawful conduct involving a minor. He will face sentencing." The whole courtroom exploded. Applause mixed with sighs of relief. Some people shed tears. Laura hugged Emily tightly, mother and daughter trembling in the moment of justice. Michael raised his head, his eyes cold but sparkling with pride. Meanwhile, Richard turned pale, his legs buckled in the chair. He screamed, struggling between the approaching police officers. "No, this isn't fair. You think I'm the only one?" The audience fell silent. Everyone turned to look at him. Richard continued, his voice breaking in hysteria. "I was told what to do. You don't get it. They own this system. I was just following orders." The sound echoed in the four walls of the court like a thunderclap. Richard's last words were no longer a defense, but turned into a haunting accusation. Laura was stunned. Her heart, which was cheering for victory, suddenly tightened in anxiety. "They own this system. Who are they?" The judge slammed the gavel down, ordering the police to escort Richard out. But the image of him being dragged away, still screaming, made everyone in the courtroom shiver. "You'll never stop them. I was just a pawn." Reporters frantically recorded every word. Cameras clicked continuously, flashes flashing like thunder. Breaking news was immediately sent out. Convicted landlord screams in court. "They own this system." Laura watched, her heart filled with new fear. Justice for Emily had been won, but Richard had just drawn a dark door. A larger, invisible force was manipulating behind the scenes. Michael leaned slightly, whispering to Laura, "Did you hear that? He wasn't acting alone. There's someone, maybe many, backing him up." This is just the tip of the iceberg. Laura held her son's hand tightly, her whole body trembling. She knew she was not out of danger. Outside the courthouse, the crowd cheered in triumph. But amid the chants of "Justice for Emily," Laura caught a glimpse of a figure silently watching from a distance, his face hidden by a hood. When he caught her eye, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Laura's heart sank. This battle had only just begun. When the trial had just ended, the atmosphere in the courtroom was still chaotic. Laura hugged Emily tightly, her eyes blurred with tears of relief and anxiety. Richard was being escorted away by the police, still screaming, "You'll never stop them. I was just a pawn." In the midst of the noise, attorney Michael Harris was packing up the files on the table. Suddenly, A figure walked past, placing a brown envelope lightly on the stack of papers in front of him. Michael was startled and looked up, but the other person had melted into the crowd. He caught just a glimpse of a shaking hand and an old gray jacket. He opened the envelope. Inside was a thick stack of hastily printed papers, ink stained at the corners. Scrawled in ballpoint pen at the top, "This is bigger than Richard. Follow the trail." Michael frowned, flipping through the pages. His heart pounded. It was a list of various civil and criminal lawsuits from various counties, all involving poor, single, vulnerable tenants. The notes next to them showed a recurring pattern: tenant behind on payments, free threatened. Claims of fabrication from neighbors or witnesses. Evidence in the file, missing or swapped. Michael turned to the last page, his eyes darkening. A familiar name appeared on the list. Jonathan Pierce, Richard's defense attorney. He whispered softly, almost to himself. So, he's been part of it all along. He turned to Laura, gave her a silent look, and stuffed the envelope into his briefcase. Laura saw the seriousness in his eyes, and her heart sank. As the three of them walked out of the courthouse, the shouts of "Justice for Emily" echoed through the hallway. But Michael knew that this was not the final victory. He felt the weight of the envelope, a key that opened a new door, darker, wider. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded, flashbulbs flashing. Laura bent down to shield Emily's face. In the crowd, Michael caught a glimpse of a hooded figure, standing apart, his cold eyes watching them. The words on the piece of paper echoed in his mind. "This is bigger than Richard." Michael swallowed, his hands tightening around the briefcase. He knew today's trial had only cut off a poisonous branch, but its real roots were still growing deep in the darkness. The shouts of "Justice for Emily" echoed throughout the courtroom. Laura held her daughter's hand tightly, shielding Emily from the forest of camera lenses and microphones pointed at her. The flashbulbs flashed continuously, overwhelming like thunder in broad daylight. Michael walked beside her, his eyes tense, his hands tightly holding the briefcase containing the confidential documents he had just received. In his heart, the joy of winning the case mixed with a surge of anxiety. His battle was far from over. Laura turned her head to follow the cheering crowd. In the midst of the chaotic sea of pipe people, she suddenly stopped. At the end of the hallway leading to the courthouse gate, right behind the crowd of reporters, there was a figure standing motionless. The person wore a dark hood, half of his face hidden in the shade. But the gaze was unmistakable, a cold, piercing stare that seemed to pierce straight through Laura. For a moment, Laura gasped. The figure was eerily familiar. Was it Mrs. Green? Or was it one of the faces that had briefly appeared in the old tenant's diary? Laura blinked, pushing through the crowd to get a closer look. But when the flashbulbs flashed again, the figure disappeared. There was only a gap in the chaotic crowd, leaving Laura with a lingering fear. Emily held her mother's hand, asking softly, "Mom, what's wrong?" Laura squeezed her small hand, trying to keep her voice calm. "Nothing, sweetheart. Let's go home." But in her eyes, the haunting was etched. Someone was still watching. As the car door closed, Laura looked back one last time. Amidst the cheers, amidst hundreds of people, she clearly felt as if a pair of eyes were still following her and her mother, not letting go. After the historic trial, the media exploded. A series of articles and television reports reported on Laura and Emily's victory. A major newspaper headlined, "Single Mother Turns the Tide, Laura Miller, the Voice of Justice." The article praised Laura as a single hero who dared to stand up to the powerful, daring to break the silence that many other victims had been forced to accept. Many other editorials also praised Emily, the 16-year-old girl who was brave enough to speak the truth in court. The image of Emily trembling but determined on the witness stand became a viral symbol on social media, with the hashtag Justice for Emily. But not everyone agreed. A local TV station aired its evening news with a controversial headline, "Victim or opportunist? The Miller case raises questions. Victim or exploiter? The Miller case raises questions." The host asked directly, "Is the whistleblowing movement being used to avoid financial responsibility? Are we entering a wave of unverified accusations?" Within hours, social media was clearly divided. One side wrote, "Laura is a symbol of resilience. She did what many would not dare. Emily is a hero. This child saved not only herself but other victims." But the other side was more caustic. "Justice should not be pushed aside by tears and media. Do we really know the whole truth? This could set a dangerous precedent. Anyone can come forward to avoid paying rent." Laura read the comments, her heart aching. She knew that she and Emily had told the truth. But the truth, in the eyes of the public, is never one-dimensional. Emily was even more affected. As she scrolled through social media, she whispered to her mother, "Mom, they still think I'm lying. So what did I do mean?" Laura hugged her child, trying to keep her voice steady. "The meaning is here, Emily. You told the truth. And the truth never goes away, even when people doubt it." Michael, when asked by reporters, simply replied, "Justice doesn't need to be popular. It only needs to be true." A few days after the trial, when public opinion was still exploding, Laura suddenly heard a knock on the door. She shivered slightly. Those knocks had been her nightmare for months. But this time, when she opened the door, she saw a strange woman and a girl about 14 years old. The woman looked haggard, thin, her eyes filled with worry. She held her daughter's hand tightly, as if she was afraid that if she let go, they would lose each other forever. "Mrs. Miller? I'm sorry to come uninvited," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "My name is Sarah Collins. This is my daughter, Megan." Laura was surprised and nodded slightly, inviting them in. Sarah sat down on the chair, her trembling hands resting on her lap. After a moment of silence, she suddenly burst into tears, choking. "He, Richard Brown, did the same thing to my daughter, but we were afraid. We didn't dare say anything." Megan lowered her head, her eyes red. Laura was stunned. Her heart felt like it was being squeezed again. Emily heard it from inside the room and walked out. The two girls' eyes met, full of sympathy, a shared pain that no words could understand. Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "When I read the news about you and Emily, I cried and trembled, because you did what I didn't dare to do. You stood up and made him pay. If it weren't for you, I would still be silent, letting Megan live in the dark forever." Laura's tears rolled down. She reached out and took Sarah's hand, squeezing it tightly. Emily sat down next to Megan, whispering, "You're not alone anymore." At that moment, Laura clearly felt what she and her mother had gone through was not in vain. The truth they had revealed not only saved themselves, but also opened the way for others, victims who had been suffocated by fear, to have the courage to speak up. Sarah wiped her tears, looking at Laura with gratitude and determination. "If you continue to fight, I won't be silent either. I'm willing to testify, not just for my daughter, but for all the children who have been harmed by him and his kind." Laura hugged Sarah, then looked at Emily and Megan sitting next to each other. The two girls held hands, their eyes shy but brighter, as if they had found a companion in a nightmare. A few days later, when Laura and Emily were slowly getting back to normal, Michael received a strange text message on his phone. On the screen were only a few short words. "Richard is just a pawn. He's not the only one." Michael stood still, his eyes dark. He knew someone was watching him, and clearly wanted him to understand that the war was not over. A few hours later, when Michael returned to the office, he found a brown package sitting right in front of the door. There was no sender's name. He opened it. Inside was a thick stack of documents, hastily typed, clipped together with a few city maps. On the first page, highlighted in bold, Richard was just one of many landlords. "Who will you save next?" Michael flipped through the pages. The list appeared before his eyes. 20 other rental addresses scattered across the city, with different names, all underlined in red. Michael's heart pounded. This was no longer the story of a perverted landlord. This was an organized network of exploitation preying on the poorest, most vulnerable single-parent families. He slumped into his chair, his hands shaking as he gripped the file. In his head, he heard Richard's voice before he was dragged out of court. "You'll never stop them. They own this system." Michael looked up, his eyes flashing with determination. He knew Laura and Emily's case was just the beginning. The road ahead would be even more dangerous, but it would also be an opportunity to expose a whole system of crime. In the late-night office, Michael spread the stack of papers from the secret envelope on the table. Laura and Emily sat beside him, the yellow light shining on the hastily printed, ink-stained lines. 20 addresses, spread across the city. All were cheap lodgings, located in the suburbs of poor neighborhoods. Next to each address were brief notes. "Tenant disappeared, case dismissed, witness retracted statement." Michael frowned, tapping his pen rhythmically. He knew that each line was a life, a story that had been extinguished in silence. Laura leaned in to look closely. Suddenly her eyes widened, her breath caught. She shakily pointed to a line on the list. "Wait, this one, 1457 Maple Street, apartment number 3B. Michael looked up. "What about it?" Laura bit her lip, her voice trembling. "Rachel, my friend Rachel used to live there. Remember I told you? She called me one night, said she knew something about Richard, wanted to meet me, but she never showed up. The next day, she vanished." Emily gasped, clutching her mother's hand. "Mom, you mean Rachel's gone because of them?" The room fell silent. The ticking of the clock seemed to deepen the haunting feeling. Michael stared at the words on the list, his hands clenched. Next to the address, 1457 Maple Street, there was a brief note, "Tenant relocated, case closed." He read it out loud, his voice cold. "Relocated. That's how they covered it up. Rachel didn't just disappear, she was erased." Laura covered her face, tears welling up. All the memories came flooding back. The midnight call, Rachel's voice trembling. "Laura, I know about Richard. Meet me tonight." And then, silence. Now the truth was clear. Rachel had not left in silence. She had fallen victim to the same network. Emily whispered, her voice choked. "So, we weren't the first, and we won't be the last, unless we stop them." Michael nodded slowly, his eyes dark but determined. "Exactly. Richard was just one piece. This list, it's the map to the rest." In that moment, the three of them looked at each other, understanding that the battle was no longer just about protecting one family. It had become a battle for all the Rachels, all the Emilys out there, those who had been and were being swallowed by the darkness. The courthouse lights had long dimmed, but for Laura Miller, the echoes of that day would never truly fade. She walked home with Emily by her side, the cool evening air brushing against their skin. For the first time in months, she felt a fragile sense of relief. Her daughter was safe, at least for now, yet her eyes betrayed the heaviness in her heart. Victory came, but it came with a cost. Sleepless nights, public humiliation, and the haunting knowledge that Richard's downfall might not end the nightmare. What if there were others? What if he wasn't the only one? The thought gnawed at her like a shadow that refused to leave. Michael's words replayed in her mind. Richard was just one piece. There's a whole network behind him. Ah! That night, as Emily finally drifted into sleep, Laura sat by the window staring into the darkness outside. She whispered to herself, words that carried both pain and truth. Silence only feeds injustice. If we hadn't spoken, he would still be free. The lessons of the past months weighed heavily. Silence only feeds injustice. Laura realized that every moment she had doubted herself, every time she had wanted to keep quiet, was exactly what men like Richard thrived on. Breaking that silence was what saved Emily. Sometimes the betrayer sits in the very house you trusted. She would never forget the sting of Mrs. Green's testimony. An elderly neighbor she thought might help instead turned into a voice against her. Trust was fragile, and betrayal could cut deeper than any knife. The truth may hurt, but lies kill faster. Laura knew this better than anyone. The truth about Richard was painful. It scarred Emily. It scarred her. But the lies, the manipulation, the tampered evidence, the whispering campaigns in the press, those lies almost destroyed them completely. She took a deep breath, staring at her daughter's sleeping face. For now, Emily was safe. For now, justice had a name. But Laura couldn't shake the feeling that the war was far from over. The next morning, just as dawn broke, Laura opened the front door to collect the newspaper. But instead of headlines, her eyes fell upon a plain brown envelope resting neatly on the welcome mat. Her stomach dropped. She hesitated, hands trembling, then picked it up. The paper was coarse, the seal already half open as if it wanted to be discovered. She slid out the contents and froze. Inside was a list. Dozens of names scrawled in black ink, each paired with an address. Young women, most of them barely older than Emily, marked as tenants from Richard's properties. Laura's heart pounded. These weren't just statistics. They were lives, faces she could almost see, voices she could almost hear. And every name on that list screamed the same truth. Emily was not the only one. At the bottom of the page, a single line was written in harsh, jagged letters. She was never his only victim. The question is, will you stop the rest? Laura's hand shook. She looked around the quiet street, eyes darting from shadow to shadow, half expecting to see someone watching. There was nothing, only the hum of a distant car, the rustle of trees. She folded the list, clutched it tightly to her chest, and whispered to herself as much as to the unseen enemy lurking in the dark. "Butts, you think fear will silence us? No, not anymore. For Emily, for Rachel." For every name on that list, Laura knew this was no ending. It was only the beginning. The story was no longer just about Richard Brown, the landlord who turned into a predator. It was about something bigger, something deeper, something more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And though fear gripped her heart, another flame burned brighter: resolve. The war for justice had just begun.